This is not just a story about a missing child. It is a story about power, fear, silence, and the devastating cost of trust placed in the wrong hands. On Hidden Truth, we uncovered the disappearance of Thomas Dean Gibson, a 2-year-old boy who vanished from his own front yard in rural Oregon and was never found. This documentary follows the final morning, the investigation, the courtroom testimony, and the unanswered questions that still echo today. Watch until the end because this story changes with every detail. If you believe real cases deserve real attention, subscribe, share, and press the bell icon to stand with Hidden Truth. This story demands your full attention because it is about a child who disappeared without a trace, a father who held authority and trust, a community that searched in vain, and a truth that may have been buried by fear, power, and decades of silence. Azalea, Oregon was a quiet rural community where families believed children were safe playing outside and neighbors believed law enforcement represented protection rather than suspicion. On the morning of March 18, 1991, Thomas Dean Gibson was 2 years old and spending time in the front yard of his family home, unaware that these ordinary moments would become the last confirmed moments of his life. His father, Larry Gibson, was a deputy sheriff of Douglas County and a respected figure in the area, while his mother, Judith Gibson, was inside the house, attending to daily tasks. Thomas's 4-year-old sister, Karen, was nearby, far too young to understand responsibility, danger, or the weight of memory that would later define her existence. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, Larry Gibson prepared to go for a jog, a decision that would later be dissected from every possible angle. Before leaving the property, Larry claimed that he attempted to shoot a feral cat on the land and missed, a detail that immediately stands out because it introduced a firearm into a moment involving a small child. After this, Larry left the property, leaving Thomas in the front yard with only his young sister nearby. According to Larry's own account, he was gone for approximately 45 minutes, a span of time that would later become the most scrutinized window in the investigation. A toddler left outside, a gun discharged nearby, a law enforcement officer walking away from his home, and a short window of time that would soon become the center of a mystery that has never been resolved. When Larry returned from his jog, Thomas was gone. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, no sounds reported by neighbors, and no physical clues that explained how a 2-year-old child could vanish so completely. Panic set in, and law enforcement was contacted. Yet this was not a typical missing child response. Larry was told not to report for duty that day, but witnesses later stated that he left the property in uniform during the early search period, a movement that would later raise serious concerns among investigators familiar with proper procedure. Karen initially told police that she had seen a man and a woman arrive in an older truck and abduct her brother. She described a blonde white woman and a dark-haired white man driving a gold or tan truck. This account shaped the earliest direction of the search, but no suspects matching this description were ever identified. Road checks, alerts, and interviews produced nothing, and as hours turned into days, the absence of evidence became impossible to ignore. An abduction story took hold quickly, but without a single trace, and with every failed lead, the possibility that Thomas never left his own property grew stronger, and more terrifying search efforts expanded rapidly and included local law enforcement, volunteers, Boy Scouts, and members of the local Mormon church. Fields, wooded areas, and nearby terrain were examined repeatedly. Despite the scale of the effort, nothing belonging to Thomas was found. No clothing, no footprints, and no physical evidence that confirmed any version of events. This absence created a vacuum where suspicion slowly began to replace hope. Larry Gibson's position complicated every step of the investigation. As a deputy sheriff and Boy Scout master, he was deeply embedded in the community and held a level of authority that shaped how questions were asked and when they were asked. One of the most critical oversights occurred early when Larry's patrol car was not searched immediately. When it was eventually examined, Investigators discovered 7 miles on the odometer that could not be accounted for through verified activity. Larry stated that he had driven to a nearby rest area searching for Thomas, but no witnesses could confirm this explanation. When a badge delays questions and a patrol vehicle escapes immediate examination, the search for a child can quietly turn into a search for accountability. Within 6 weeks, investigators began treating Larry Gibson as the prime suspect, though this shift was not announced publicly. The idea that danger may have come from inside the home rather than outside shattered the town's sense of certainty and divided opinion among those who once stood united. Larry resigned from the sheriff department in 1992 and later moved his family to Montana, a decision that intensified public suspicion rather than easing it. A community was left with empty fields, a missing child, and a growing fear that the truth had been hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. As Azalea returned to quiet routines, the mystery remained unresolved, waiting for a voice that had been too afraid to speak and a truth that would surface years later with devastating consequences. As days passed without any trace of Thomas Dean Gibson, the investigation began to shift away from the possibility of an unknown abduction and toward the uncomfortable reality that the truth might exist within the family itself. Law enforcement officials reviewed Larry Gibson's statements repeatedly and noticed subtle but important inconsistencies in how he described the morning of March 18, 1991. These were not dramatic contradictions, but small changes in timing, movement, and explanation that collectively created doubt. Investigators also revisited the early decision not to immediately search Larry's patrol vehicle, a delay that violated standard procedure in cases involving missing children. When the vehicle was finally examined, the discovery of 7 unaccounted miles on the odometer raised new and troubling questions. Larry claimed these miles came from driving to a nearby rest area while searching for Thomas, yet no witnesses or evidence confirmed this journey. The focus of the case shifted quietly but permanently, as investigators realized that the most important questions were no longer about strangers on the road but about a father, a badge, and a timeline that did not hold together under scrutiny. Search efforts continued in surrounding areas, including locations that were difficult to access and rarely visited. One such area was Swamp Creek, a remote and heavily wooded region where investigators theorized Thomas's body could have been concealed. Despite repeated searches, no remains were ever recovered. The absence of physical evidence forced investigators to rely heavily on behavioral analysis and testimony. This placed enormous pressure on witnesses, especially on Karen Gibson, who was only 4 years old at the time of her brother's disappearance. Her initial account of an abduction began to lose credibility as no supporting evidence surfaced and as investigators considered the influence of fear and confusion on a child so young. In 1992, Larry Gibson resigned from his position as a deputy sheriff of Douglas County. Shortly afterward, he relocated with his family to Montana, a move that many viewed as suspicious rather than coincidental. While some believed he was attempting to escape public scrutiny, others argued that he was simply seeking distance from a painful and unresolved tragedy. The community in Azalea remained divided, caught between loyalty to a familiar authority figure and the growing discomfort of unanswered questions. A move across state lines did not close the case. It deepened doubt, prolonged uncertainty, and left behind a community struggling to accept that the search for a child had become a search for accountability. The turning point came in 1993 when Judith Gibson separated from Larry and returned to Oregon with her children. This separation altered the power dynamic within the family and created a space where fear no longer dictated silence. It was during this period that Karen disclosed a different version of events to law enforcement. She stated that on the day Thomas disappeared, she witnessed her father beating her brother outside the home and later placing him into his patrol car. According to Karen, she had been threatened and warned not to speak about what she saw, a claim that aligned with investigators' concerns about delayed disclosure. This revelation changed the direction of the investigation permanently. Prosecutors now believed they had an explanation that accounted for the missing child, the unsearched patrol vehicle, and the unexplained mileage. They theorized that Thomas had been fatally injured during a moment of rage and that his body was concealed before the search efforts began. While no physical remains were found, the accumulation of circumstantial evidence and testimony began to form a narrative that could no longer be ignored. A child's testimony, once dismissed as confusion, became the most powerful piece of evidence, transforming years of doubt into a case built on memory, fear, and the courage to finally speak. By early 1994, investigators believed they had sufficient grounds to move forward. The case was no longer about where Thomas had gone, but about what had happened within the walls of a family home, and the authority that may have shielded it. The stage was set for an arrest that would shock 2 states and bring the hidden tension of this case into public view. On April 14, 1994, Larry Gibson was arrested in Townsend, Montana, and charged with second-degree murder in the death of his son, Thomas Dean Gibson. The arrest sent shockwaves through both Montana and Oregon, reopening a case that many believed would never reach this stage due to the absence of physical remains. Larry was extradited to Oregon, where he awaited trial under intense public scrutiny. Prosecutors argued that the evidence, while circumstantial, formed a coherent and compelling narrative of violence, concealment, and intimidation. The defense maintained that without a body, the case rested too heavily on memory and assumption. The arrest marked a historic moment, as a former law enforcement officer stood accused of killing his own child, challenging the very idea that authority could shield someone from consequences. The trial began in January 1995 and lasted 6 weeks. Karen Gibson became the prosecution's central witness, a role that placed immense emotional strain on a child asked to testify against her own father. She described witnessing Larry beating Thomas after the child approached a cat that Larry had shot earlier that day. According to court documents, prosecutors believed Larry then placed Thomas into his patrol car, hid the body in a plastic bag, and later disposed of it away from the property. Karen testified that she was threatened and warned not to speak, explaining her years of silence. The defense argued that Karen's testimony had been influenced by her mother and that her memory had been shaped by suggestion rather than truth. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence and questioned the reliability of a child's recollection years after the event. The courtroom became a space where grief, loyalty, and doubt collided daily, leaving jurors to weigh not only evidence but the emotional weight of the testimony before them. A courtroom became the battlefield where memory faced reason, where a child's voice carried the weight of a life lost, and where the absence of a body forced justice to rely on human truth. Additional testimony came from Larry's half-sister, Debbie Kalick, who stated that Larry had called her in a panic after Thomas disappeared and confessed to killing the child. She also described comments made by Karen expressing fear of being placed in a hole like her brother. These statements added another layer of credibility to the prosecution's case, while further dividing public opinion. After weeks of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. In March 1995, Larry Gibson was convicted of manslaughter rather than second-degree murder. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial and after the verdict. The sentence called for 15 to 18 months of imprisonment, much of which had already been served during pretrial custody. Larry was released in 1996, a fact that left many feeling that justice had been only partially served. A conviction without a body left questions unanswered, emotions unresolved, and a nation wondering whether the truth had been fully revealed or forever lost. The legal chapter of the case had closed, but the mystery of Thomas Dean Gibson remained, unresolved and haunting, waiting for history to decide whether justice had truly been done. When Larry Gibson was released from prison in 1996 after serving less than a year for the manslaughter of his son, the legal chapter of the case ended, but the emotional and moral questions did not. To many observers, the sentence felt painfully inadequate when measured against the loss of a child whose body was never recovered. For others, the conviction itself represented a rare example of accountability in a case built without physical remains. Larry maintained his innocence before, during, and after his imprisonment, a stance that only deepened public division and kept the case alive in conversation long after the courtroom doors closed. A father walked free, a child remained missing, and the line between legal closure and moral resolution grew wider with each passing year as the community struggled to accept what justice really meant. After his release, Larry Gibson attempted to reshape the narrative surrounding his son's disappearance. Around 2001, he created a public webpage asking for help in finding Thomas, presenting himself not as a convicted man, but as a grieving father still searching for answers. For some, this act appeared manipulative and deeply unsettling, while others saw it as evidence of unresolved grief and denial. The page reignited debate and anger, reminding the public that despite a conviction, the most basic question remained unanswered. The case continued to live on through media exposure. Thomas Dean Gibson's disappearance was featured in 2 episodes of the national documentary series Unsolved Mysteries, bringing renewed attention to the case and exposing it to a wider audience. His photograph was also included in the music video for the song Runaway Train by the band Soul Asylum, where his image appeared alongside other missing children. Thomas was the youngest child featured in that video, a fact that underscored the vulnerability at the heart of the story. A child's face flashed across television screens and music videos, turning a private tragedy into a public memory that refused to fade, even as years passed without answers despite renewed attention. No new evidence emerged that could lead to the recovery of Thomas's remains. Swamp Creek and other suspected locations yielded nothing, leaving investigators and the public with theories rather than certainty. The absence of a body continued to complicate the case, making it impossible to confirm exactly how Thomas died or where he was taken. This uncertainty left space for speculation, doubt, and ongoing pain for those connected to the case. Karen Gibson's life was permanently shaped by her role as the key witness against her father. Her testimony, given under immense emotional pressure, became the foundation of the case, and with it came lifelong consequences. Supporters viewed her as a courageous survivor, who finally broke free from fear, while critics questioned whether any child should bear such responsibility. Regardless of perspective, her voice altered the course of the investigation and ensured the case would never simply disappear. A child who once stood silent in a front yard became the voice that changed everything, carrying a truth too heavy for anyone so young to bear as the years passed. The story of Thomas Dean Gibson became less about solving a mystery and more about confronting uncomfortable realities. It forced society to question how authority can influence investigations, how fear can silence witnesses, and how justice functions when evidence is incomplete. The case remained open in memory if not in law, standing as a reminder that some truths are never fully recovered. Decades after Thomas Dean Gibson disappeared, the case continues to raise questions that have no clear answers. Where is Thomas? What truly happened during those 45 minutes on March 18, 1991? Did the justice system reach the truth or merely the most convincing version of events? These questions persist because the case sits at the intersection of law, memory, authority, and loss, a place where certainty is rare and doubt thrives. The passage of time has not brought clarity, only distance, and with each year, the chances of recovering physical truth fade, while emotional questions grow louder and more painful. Thomas's disappearance is often cited in discussions about missing children cases, where remains are never found. It highlights the limitations of investigative systems when early mistakes are made and when power dynamics interfere with procedure. The delayed search of the patrol vehicle, the reliance on a child's early testimony, and the lack of forensic evidence combined to create a case that would always be controversial no matter the verdict. The role of the community also remains a critical element of the story. Azalea was once united in hope and trust, yet the case fractured those bonds. Some residents believed the conviction was necessary and justified, while others believed Larry Gibson had been unfairly targeted. This division reflected a broader discomfort with accepting that danger can exist within familiar and trusted spaces when a community is forced to question its own assumptions about safety and authority. The result is not healing, but a long-lasting unease that lingers for generations. The absence of Thomas's body remains the most haunting aspect of the case. Without remains, there is no burial, no physical closure, and no definitive confirmation of events. This absence transforms the loss into something abstract and ongoing, a wound that never fully closes. For those who remember Thomas, he exists as a memory frozen in time, forever 2 years old, forever missing. Media coverage ensured that Thomas's name would not be forgotten, yet remembrance is not the same as resolution. Each retelling of the story reopens old wounds and raises the same unanswered questions. The case has become a cautionary tale about how fragile truth can be when evidence is scarce and fear shapes silence. A story that should have ended with a child coming home instead ended with questions that no courtroom could answer and no sentence could resolve. As of 2025, Thomas Dean Gibson's whereabouts remain unknown. His case stands as a reminder that justice is not always synonymous with truth, and that some losses resist closure no matter how much time passes. The silence surrounding his final moments continues to echo, asking the world to remember not just what happened, but what was lost. The following are verified references that confirm this case is real, documented, and publicly recorded. This documentary is based on official records from the Oregon State Police, detailed case files from the Charlie Project, national coverage from the documentary series Unsolved Mysteries, archived newspaper reporting from Oregon and Montana publications, court records from the manslaughter trial of Larry Gibson, and documented media coverage related to the Runaway Train music video featuring missing children. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that missing voices deserve to be heard and uncomfortable truths deserve light, then subscribe, share, and press the bell icon to stay connected with Hidden Truth, where we continue to uncover the stories that refuse to disappear.